The dust hung thick in the air, a cruel, mocking halo around Sarah. The sun beat down, unrelenting, much like the stares of the townsfolk gathered in the square. She stood on the rough wooden platform, her hands clasped instinctively over the slight swell of her belly, a gesture both protective and utterly futile. Her in-laws, dressed in their Sunday best, stood nearby, their faces grim masks of self-righteousness, their voices low and urgent as they haggled with a potential buyer. They spoke of her as if she were livestock, a broken tool, a shame to their name. Each word was a fresh lash, a searing reminder of the betrayal that had led her to this moment. Her husband, God rest his soul, had been a good man, but his family's piety proved a harsher judge than any law. They claimed her very presence, a black woman with an unborn mixed-race child, desecrated their lineage. Shame coiled in her gut, a living thing, squeezing the air from her lungs. She looked at the faces in the crowd, a sea of white judgmental eyes, feeling utterly exposed, unwanted. The desperation tasted like ash in her mouth. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her own family was too far, too poor, too broken to help. This auction was their final, brutal solution, their ultimate act of abandonment. A man in the front, large and silent, caught her eye. He wasn't gawking like the others, but watching, his expression unreadable, almost somber. He was a rancher, by the look of his worn leather vest and calloused hands. She braced herself for his bid, for the sound of her future being sold away, another indignity in a lifetime of quiet suffering. But then, his voice, low and clear, cut through the buzzing crowd. Not a bid, but a question, a statement that twisted the air itself. "I ain't buyin' her," he said, his gaze fixed solely on her. "I'm offerin' to marry her." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It pressed down on her, leaving her breathless. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Her in-laws gasped, scandalized, their righteous fury erupting in a flurry of accusations. "You can't! She's soiled! A burden!" Thomas, for that was his name, merely held their gaze, unwavering. He hadn't looked away from Sarah, not once. His offer hung in the air, a strange, impossible lifeline thrown into her sea of despair. Marry her? A stranger, a white man, buying her freedom not with coin but with a vow? Her mind reeled. It was absurd, a desperate measure, yet a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. A sliver of choice stirred within her. The crowd muttered, a low, ominous hum of disapproval. This was not how things were done. This was an affront to their rigid sensibilities, an unholy union by their estimation. Sarah's eyes, wide with shock and a terrifying, fragile hope, met Thomas's. He offered no grand promises, no eloquent pleas. He simply stood there, solid and calm, waiting. He didn't demand, didn't coerce. He presented a path, however unbelievable, and left the decision to her. The choice, though born of dire circumstances, felt monumental. It was her dignity, her life, her unborn child's future. She could refuse and face the humiliation of being sold like cattle, or she could step into the unknown with this quiet stranger. The weight of the moment was immense, almost crushing. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The sun beat down, but a chill ran through her. This wasn't salvation in the way she might have dreamed, but it was a desperate chance for safety, for a future that wasn't dictated by the cruelty of others. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she nodded. A single, decisive nod. The breath she'd been holding finally escaped, ragged and soft. The deed was done. The papers were signed, rushed and terse, witnessed by a reluctant clerk who seemed to wish he were anywhere but there. The ceremony was a brief, hushed affair. A few hurried words from a nervous justice of the peace. No church bells, no joyful blessings. Just the solemnity of a legal transaction cloaked in the sanctity of marriage. Thomas's hand, large and warm, briefly touched hers as he slipped a plain silver band onto her finger. The metal felt alien, heavy with the weight of unspoken agreements. Then they were in his wagon, rattling away from the town, from the hateful stares, from the suffocating shame. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the creak of the wheels and the distant cries of birds. Sarah sat stiffly beside him, clutching her hands in her lap. The new ring, a strange, foreign presence. Every mile put more distance between her and her past, but the scars lingered, deep and raw. She tried not to think of her first husband, the man she'd loved, whose death had led to this unimaginable fate. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure his face, but it was fading, replaced by the jarring image of the auction block, the cold faces of his family. The overwhelming feeling of abandonment pressed in on her. She was a woman, pregnant and alone, cast out and then taken in by a stranger, whose kindness felt like a riddle. The ranch rose from the plains like a solitary sentinel, a sturdy, unassuming house built of timber and stone, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. It was isolated, miles from the nearest town, a stark contrast to the small, gossiping community she'd just left. The vastness of the land, the endless sky, was both daunting and strangely comforting. No prying eyes here, just the silence of the wind and the whisper of tall grasses. Thomas led her inside. The house was simple, clean, and surprisingly warm. Smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs, he moved with a quiet efficiency, lighting a lamp, stoking the fire in the hearth. He offered her a seat, a plate of stew, and a cup of steaming tea. His kindness was not effusive, but practical, rooted in action rather than words. It was a gentle, almost hesitant gesture, as if he understood the fragile state she was in. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth, the first truly nourishing meal she'd had in days. Her body ached from the emotional ordeal, and the simple act of being fed, of being cared for without expectation, brought a prickle of tears to her eyes. She fought them back. She wouldn't break, not now. He showed her to a small room, clean and spare, with a freshly made bed. "You'll be comfortable here," he said, his voice low. "Sleep, we can talk in the morning." He left her alone, respecting her need for solitude, for a moment to breathe. The bed was soft, a luxury she hadn't known in years. She lay down, feeling the steady thrum of her baby within her, a silent companion through her despair. Her shame, though still present, felt less acute here, buffered by the quiet dignity of the house. The scars of her past were deep, but this place, this man, offered a tentative, fragile promise of safety. She wondered about him. This man who had taken her in. What kind of person married a stranger, a woman with nothing but a past and an unborn child? He was a mystery, a quiet man who seemed to carry his own burdens, though she couldn't yet decipher them. The memory of her father selling her into marriage, a small girl for a few acres of land, flashed through her mind. It was a wound that never truly healed, festering beneath the surface of every forced smile, every polite nod. This time, Thomas had asked. He had given her a choice, however desperate. That difference, stark and profound, lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't freedom as she once imagined it, but it was a step away from complete subjugation. Days turned into a week, then two. Thomas was consistently quiet, observant. He never pressed her for her story, never prodded at her wounds. He simply allowed her to exist, to recover in her own time. She found herself watching him, too. He worked tirelessly around the ranch, his movements economical and strong. He seemed to prefer the company of his horses and cattle to that of people, a man comfortable in his own solitude. She saw a flicker of loneliness in his eyes sometimes, a hidden sorrow that mirrored her own. It was a silent understanding, a bridge built not on words, but on shared quiet. She began to help where she could, cleaning the house, mending his clothes. Her hands, accustomed to labor, found purpose again. The work was simple, but it filled the empty hours, distracting her from the persistent hum of anxiety. She felt the baby kick more strongly now, a reassuring presence, a tiny life dependent on her. The child was a constant reminder of her past, of the pain and loss, but also a fragile seed of future hope. Thomas would sometimes speak to her belly, a low, rumbling murmur, his voice surprisingly gentle. He spoke to the baby as if it were already there, a part of their quiet household. His respect, his unspoken acknowledgement of her condition, was a balm to her battered spirit. He never made her feel like a burden. never treated her with anything but quiet regard. Slowly, tentatively, a seed of trust began to grow. It was a fragile thing, born of desperation and circumstance. But it was there. She found herself sharing small things, a memory of a childhood game, a simple observation about the weather. He listened, truly listened, his gaze steady. These quiet exchanges, these shared silences, were building something new, something she hadn't anticipated. Winter settled over the plains, a stark, unforgiving blanket of white. The ranch became a small island in a vast, frozen ocean. The isolation deepened, cutting them off from the outside world, from the whispers and judgments of the town. This natural barrier, however harsh, served to deepen the tentative connection between Sarah and Thomas. Inside the sturdy ranch house, a new rhythm began to form. Sarah found a quiet contentment in the daily routines: baking bread, mending clothes, caring for the house. The work grounded her, giving her a sense of purpose beyond simply existing. Thomas, in turn, appreciated her presence, her quiet efficiency. He taught her how to milk the cow, how to care for the chickens, patiently guiding her hands. It was in these shared tasks that their conversation slowly began to unfold. They spoke of the land, of the weather, of the challenges of ranching. Thomas, usually so reserved, began to share snippets of his own life, not as a lament, but as simple facts. He spoke of his parents, long gone, of inheriting the ranch, of a life lived largely alone. She saw the quiet strength in him, the resilience forged by solitude and hard work. It was a different kind of scar than hers, but a scar, nonetheless. Sarah, in turn, felt a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame that had gripped her for so long. She found herself confiding in him, first small details, then deeper feelings. She spoke of her first husband, of the love they shared, and the cruel twist of fate that had left her adrift. She spoke of the despair, of feeling truly unwanted, of the shame of the auction block. Thomas listened, his gaze unwavering, his presence a comforting anchor. He offered no pity, only a quiet understanding. He never told her she was broken. Instead, he simply showed her, through his actions, that she was worthy of kindness, of safety. The baby, growing steadily within her, was a constant, joyous reminder of the future. Thomas would place his hand on her belly, feeling the kicks, a small smile touching his lips. It was a shared anticipation, a silent promise. This isolated ranch, this man, was slowly, tentatively, becoming her home, a place of belonging she hadn't dared to dream of. But the peace of their isolated winter was fragile, a thin shield against the coming storm. Spring arrived, and with it, the reopening of paths to the outside world. The whispers from town, long suppressed by distance and snow, began to trickle back, carried on the wind like bitter pollen. Thomas would return from trips to town for supplies, his jaw a little tighter, his eyes a shade darker. He didn't speak of the gossip directly, but she felt the weight of it, the foreshadowed community judgment closing in. One blustery afternoon, a buggy pulled up their long, winding driveway. It wasn't the sheriff, but Mrs. Albright, the town's most prominent church lady, accompanied by her equally stern sister. They were draped in severe black dresses, their faces set in expressions of grim purpose. Sarah's heart clenched. This was it. They had come to judge, to condemn. The women entered, their eyes sweeping over the humble home, assessing, dissecting. Their questions were cloaked in polite concern, but their intent was clear: to ascertain the truth of the scandalous rumors, to expose the perceived sin. They spoke of propriety, of God's law, of the scandal she had brought upon this quiet community. They implicitly accused her of impropriety, of entrapping Thomas, of defying societal norms with her very existence. The air grew heavy with their judgment. Sarah felt the old shame rise, hot and bitter, threatening to choke her. She was desperately aware of the child growing within her, an innocent life caught in the crossfire of their self-righteousness. This baby, her child, was now a potential target of their moral outrage, a living symbol of her supposed transgression. Thomas, however, remained calm. His voice, usually so quiet, held an edge of steel. He answered their veiled questions with simple facts, defending their marriage, his choice, without apology or explanation. He stood firm, a silent wall between Sarah and their condemnation. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence was a powerful deterrent. Mrs. Albright and her sister eventually left, their faces a mixture of frustration and continued disapproval. But the seed of threat had been planted. Sarah knew this wasn't the end. The outside world had found them, and it was not yet willing to leave them in peace. The incident with Mrs. Albright was merely the opening salvo. The veiled threats escalated. Thomas returned from town one day with news that the local banker, a man who had always been cordial, had quietly hinted at difficulties with their loan, citing unforeseen complications and community sentiment. It was a clear warning, a subtle attempt to financially cripple Thomas and force Sarah's departure. That night, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah, burdened by guilt, felt a familiar desperation clawing at her throat. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely a whisper, I can go. You don't deserve this. I'm a burden." She meant it. She could take her child, somehow, somewhere, and disappear, sparing him the ruin her presence seemed to invite. It was a test, a silent question. Would his quiet kindness truly extend to sacrificing his livelihood for her? For a woman he barely knew, for a child not his own. Thomas looked at her, his eyes steady, unwavering. He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers firm around hers. "You are not a burden, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "And you are not broken. This choice, it was mine, and I stand by it." His words, simple and honest, were a balm to her soul. They were an affirmation, a dismissal of the shame that had clung to her for so long. He wasn't just offering her safety, he was offering her value, a truth she had almost forgotten. He spoke of the land, of his ancestors who had tamed it, of his stubbornness in the face of adversity. He wasn't a man who ran from a fight, especially not one for what he believed was right. He reminded her of the quiet dignity he had shown her from the start. He was choosing her, choosing them, over the comfort of acceptance. The weight of that choice, the depth of his loyalty, brought tears to her eyes. This was not a heroic triumph, but a quiet, profound victory. The external threat might persist, but their internal bond had solidified. They would face it together. The night the baby decided to come was fierce. A late spring storm howling around the ranch house, mirroring the intensity within. The wind screamed, rattling the windows, and the rain lashed down, a relentless rhythm against the roof. Sarah's contractions began in earnest, sharp pains that seized her, demanding all her focus. Thomas, usually so reserved, was transformed. He moved with a quiet urgency, building up the fire, boiling water, his face etched with concern. He was no midwife, but his presence was a constant, solid anchor in the swirling chaos. He spoke to her, low and reassuring, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, holding her hand when the pain became unbearable. She gripped his hand, her knuckles white, her trust in him absolute. In that intimate space, stripped bare by vulnerability and raw emotion, their bond deepened further than any words could convey. She saw him not just as a protector, but as a true partner, a man capable of profound tenderness. The hours blurred into a haze of pain and effort. Thomas never left her side. His strength poured into her, his unwavering presence a testament to his quiet loyalty. And then, finally, with a last, desperate push, a cry pierced the stormy night. A tiny, fragile cry, filled with the raw sound of new life. Thomas cut the cord, his hand surprisingly gentle, and placed the squalling infant on Sarah's chest. A boy, small and perfect, with a shock of dark hair. He was a miracle born of despair, a testament to the strange, beautiful path they had chosen. Looking at her son, then at Thomas, Sarah felt a surge of love so powerful it stole her breath. This child, born into uncertainty, was now a symbol of their belonging, a living extension of their unlikely family. Thomas, his eyes shining with unshed tears, reached out a finger and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. He was a father now, in every way that mattered. In that moment, the world outside, with its judgments and threats, seemed to fade. Only the three of them remained. A small, fragile family forged in the crucible of hardship, bound by a love that was both unexpected and deeply, profoundly real. The storm that had accompanied their son's birth raged for another day, then broke, leaving behind a world washed clean, bathed in the soft, hopeful light of dawn. The air was crisp, the sky a vast, endless blue. Just as the storm had cleared, so too did the immediate threat from the town seem to recede. The birth of the baby, a living, breathing human being, seemed to disarm the most vociferous of their detractors. The quiet news spread, perhaps through a more sympathetic visitor or an understanding deliveryman, that Thomas had indeed married the woman, and she had birthed a healthy child. The scandal, once a topic of heated gossip, began to cool, replaced by a quiet, if grudging, acceptance. Some neighbors, previously aloof, offered hesitant nods when Thomas was in town. A few women, overcoming their initial prejudice, even brought small, practical gifts for the baby, a quiet acknowledgement of their humanity. These were not heroic triumphs, but quiet wins, small victories that solidified their place, however precarious, in the community. The ranch, once a place of refuge born of desperation, transformed into a true sanctuary, a beloved home. Sarah, holding her son, felt the healing begin in earnest. The scars of abandonment, of being unwanted, of the public shaming, were still there, etched into her memory, but they no longer defined her. They were a part of her story, but not the whole of it. Her identity was no longer solely tied to her past suffering, but to the present, to this new, fragile family. Thomas and Sarah, united by the shared experience of the birth and the quiet defense of their home, found their bond deepening into something profound. Their love was not born of youthful passion, but of mutual respect, shared hardship, and a quiet, unwavering loyalty. Their conversations, once tentative, flowed more freely now, imbued with the deep understanding that comes from navigating life's hardest passages together. The sound of their son's cooing filled the house, a melody of peace, a constant reminder of the affirmation they had found in each other. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm, a quiet testament to their resilience. The seasons turned, bringing new challenges and quiet joys. Their son grew, a vibrant, curious child who filled their days with laughter and wonder. He was a tangible symbol of the future, a beacon of the peace they had found. Sarah often watched Thomas with their son, her heart swelling with a love that transcended their initial, desperate bargain. He was a man of few words, but his devotion was evident in every patient lesson, every tender touch. He had chosen her, chosen them, and in doing so, had healed parts of her soul she thought were forever broken. She still carried the scars of her past: the betrayal, the public shaming, the desperation mistaken for weakness. Those memories would always be a part of her, lessons etched deep. But they no longer consumed her. She was not defined by what she had endured, but by the choices she had made, by the kindness she had found, and by the belonging she had earned. The external world, while not entirely free of prejudice, had largely accepted their quiet existence. They were a peculiar family, perhaps, but they were a family nonetheless. Their story was not one of grand heroics or dramatic escape, but of quiet wins, choosing to stay when it would have been easier to flee, sacrificing social standing for the sake of integrity, protecting the innocent life of their child. The ranch, a patch of land under an immense sky, became a microcosm of their world, a place where trust had blossomed from uncertainty, where safety had been forged in the fires of adversity. Sarah often sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains, the silence vast and profound. She was home. Not the home she had been born to, nor the one she had married into, but a home built by courage, sealed by loyalty, and sustained by a quiet, enduring love. She was not broken. She was whole, her spirit finally at peace, living a life of quiet affirmation, looking towards the unwritten future with her husband and their son, a true family, against all odds.